the whole idea of this building even existing here is that we can, or that the community gives resources to content creators, enabling you guys to create whatever vision you have, and then ultimately you're submitting back into the station so that we can pump that out onto our television stations. So it's super cool because you can create something and it can pop up on television for absolutely free. And your friends and stuff can watch it at home, you can watch it on the television. And public access, we're dropping the access, it's not just public television, it's actually on Apple, on Roku, on all sorts of streaming devices. So you don't have to have a basic cable to watch it. You can actually watch it on streaming devices, which is really cool because now it's like on the internet. So in this class, you do have access to this camera and this lens. If you wanted access to more lenses and quite frankly better lenses, you should take the cinematography class. So this class we're talking about how do you control the light coming into your camera. In the cinematography, they're talking about why. Why would you use a wide angle? Why would you use a zoomed in angle? Why would you use a high angle versus a low angle? Why would you have camera movement? Why would you place your person in that particular spot? That's a cinematography class, and it will give you access to more lenses, to prime lenses, which have a much bigger aperture. All right, so whenever I think about shooting, the first thing I think about is light. And whenever I'm thinking about light, I'm thinking about it in compartments. I'm thinking about it in a hierarchy. So, very first thing I think about, it's not even the camera. It's what do I have available? What are the lights that I can work with? So the first thing I'm going to write is outside of the camera. There's going to be 4 things that I'm really thinking about. And they all have to do with lights. But in order to kind of better prepare for your shoot, I want you to start kind of thinking about it in compartments like this. Because it's going to make everything a little bit easier. Because what we're going to end up finding out here pretty soon is that these cameras, while they're amazing, they're not magical. And you have to, there's a little bit of give and a little bit of take, just like you were saying. There's a little bit of give and a little bit of take, and you have to make some compromises. So we're going to see what kind of compromises those are. So the first thing I'm thinking about is outside the camera. Are we doing an interview outside? Do we have sunlight? Are we placing something next to a window? Do we have interior lights already in the room? Did we rent a bunch of lights? What are the lights that we have? That's the first thing I'm thinking about. The second thing I'm thinking about, now I'm thinking about the camera, but still actually not even the body of the camera, I'm thinking about the lens. And more in particular, I'm thinking about what's called the aperture, or another word for aperture, iris. So technically, aperture is the housing unit of the iris, but these two are interchangeable. So anytime you hear somebody saying iris or aperture, they're talking about the hole in the lens. In your lens, there's a hole that opens and closes, and you're controlling how open it is or how closed it is. The more open it is, the more what comes in? Light. The more light comes in, so your image becomes brighter. Right? As you close it, your image is getting darker because you're blocking some of that light from coming in, right? Aperture in iris is measured in f-stop. So there's a numerical value to how big that hole or how small that hole is. Just like length is measured in feet or in inches, aperture or iris is measured in f-stops. So there's a numerical value to that, okay? Here's kind of the tricky part. The smaller the number, the bigger the hole. As your number gets bigger, your hole gets smaller. And so you're controlling that number. You're controlling whether it's a big hole or a small hole. And we're going to do the f-stop scale. And the f-stop scale is just a scale that's going to help us think about what is happening as we're changing those numbers. How much light are we actually losing? So whenever you're doing the f-stop scale, and again, whenever you're out there in the field, you're not thinking about all of this. This is just kind of an extra tool to help you understand how much light you're either adding or losing as you're changing those numbers. So f-stop scale, we're going to start with 2 numbers. The number 1 and the number 1.4. If we were thinking about the iris like a door, a 1 is like there's not even a door, it's just a frame. So you'll never see a lens that has an aperture of 1 or an f-stop of 1. That's just like completely wide open. But for the purposes of the scale, we're going to start there. So we have 1 and a 1.4. And a 1.4 is pretty wide open. That's very wide open. It's like your door is almost all the way open. So every lens is built differently. This particular lens has an f-stop of a maximum f-stop of 4. That's as wide as this particular lens will let you get. But we're going to see there's a lot of other lenses that can get you even wider. So what we're going to do with this f-stop scale is all we're going to do is we're going to double it up. So what's double of 1? Double of 2 is 4, 8, 16. 2.8, 5.6, we're going to round up, 11.22, closed. So these are some of the numbers in your f-stop range. These aren't all of the numbers. There's other numbers in between. But for the purposes of the scale, we're going to look at these particular numbers, okay? I'm going to start here at 2. If 2 is a big hole like this, as we go down this scale, is 4 going to be bigger or smaller than 2?
Smaller.
Smaller, right? Because it's a bigger number, so we're losing some light. And how much light are we exactly losing? We're losing half. So as you go down this scale, you're losing half the light. If 2 is this big, 4 is going to be half the amount of that hole. So while numerically 2 and 4 are only 2 values away, very close, when we're talking about the f-stop, when we're talking about aperture, that is a huge difference. You just lost half of your available light. Okay? So how's 8 going to look? Well, half the size of 4, right? And 16 is going to look half the size of that. We come over here, is 2.8 going to be bigger or smaller than 2? It's close to the same, but it's not quite the same. 2.8 is a bigger number, so it's going to be smaller than 2. So we'll come over here, about that size. 5.6, how's 5.6 going to look?
Smaller than 2.8, but bigger than 4.
Smaller than 2.8, bigger than 4, literally half the size of 2.8. That's why I'm kind of, so while there are 2 columns, don't think of them as separate. Like this is just to help us understand what's happening to the numbers. But like I said, remember, there's 2.2, 2.5, 4.5, 5.2, and all sorts of other numbers in between these. But we're just focusing on these numbers because it's easy, the math is. So 5.6 is going to be half the size of that. 11 is going to be half the size of 5.6. 22 is going to be half the size of 11. This is like the door is completely closed and no light is able to come in. Again, the aperture is located in the lens. Not all lenses are built the same. Okay? So this particular lens can open up to a 4, but as we see on our scale, there's lenses that open up even bigger, right? So if you're shooting in a really low light situation, this particular lens probably isn't that good for very low light situations. Okay, so that's just kind of a heads up. The best lens I've ever dealt with is a 1.2. But just to kind of give you an example, this is a 4. They make this exact same lens, G-series Sony lens, that's a 2.8. So 4 to 2.8. The difference, $700. So that's a huge difference, right? And you'd think like, oh, that's not that big of a difference, but it really does allow you to shoot a lot more in a lot more situations. So the other thing that the aperture does is it affects what's called the depth of field. DOF, depth of field. Has anybody ever heard of depth of field?
Yep.
So depth of field, what it is literally the length in which is in focus. So you can have a shallow depth of field, where I only want this coffee cup in focus, or you can have a deep depth of field, where I want every single person in here to be in focus. And again, as a creative director, as a cinematographer, you have to think about the situation. Because as a filmmaker, you are in control of what the viewer is watching. You're telling them what you want them to watch. So if the scene is about the coffee cup, is it important to have you guys in focus? Not really. We just want the focus here, right? Or if I'm shooting the Grand Canyon, well, it's a huge space, and they're paying me to get the entire Grand Canyon, well, I want to have a really deep depth of field, right? As opposed to maybe if I was shooting a ladybug, that was the focus, or I want a shallow depth of field, because ladybugs are little, right? And if I had a big, deep depth of field, well, you're not going to know that I wanted you to pay attention to the ladybug. You're going to think, oh, maybe it's the field, maybe it's the trees, right? So I want to decrease my depth of field, so that way you focus on the ladybug, right? We have a bunch of lights that we rented. Let's go ahead and flood it. We need more light in here. Or you can say, if you're on a tight budget and didn't rent a bunch of lights, all right, everybody that has a car, let's go ahead and beam our headlights out there so we can have more light. But that kind of might look weird too, right? So you use another tool that your camera has. And that is called the ISO. Or this camera also allows you to shoot in gain. And what ISO and gain are simple. They're the same thing. Again, kind of interchangeable. They're measured differently and they work differently, but they affect the same thing, which is the sensor, and they're affecting the sensor sensitivity. So you're affecting the sensor sensitivity. The sensor literally replaces film. Back in the day, they used to shoot, well, they still do today, but actual film, like an actual material, right? Nowadays, it is a sensor. So the sensor is literally replacing the film. Film used to have sensitivity, now sensor has sensitivity. The sensitivity part is easy because unlike aperture, where big number equals small hole, ISO and gain work pretty easily because the bigger the number, the more sensitive you're making your sensor. The more sensitive, the brighter you're making your image. So the higher the number, the brighter the image. The lower the number, well, the less bright. Okay? So if I'm back at that scenario, right, where I'm shooting this bar scene, and I'm like, nobody has a car, or it's gonna look weird, we don't have enough money to buy lights, I'm like, okay, I need to go ahead and boost my sensor's sensitivity so I can raise my ISO or your gain. You get to decide which one you work in. It's just a preference, and they're numbered a little bit different. So these cameras, again, aren't magical, right? They're great, but they're not magical. So you can't just be like, let me boost that ISO all the way so I can get really good shots in low light situations. You're not going to get good shots in low light situations if you go too high. You got to be careful with the ISO and the gain, because the higher you go, the more degradation you are adding to your image. And degradation in terms of noise and grain. Those are two very common terms of degradation that you'll hear. Oh, that looks very noisy. That looks very grainy. Has anybody ever tried to shoot a picture with their camera phone at night? Or in a dark situation? How does that look? Awful, right? You can see what almost looks like little pieces of rice or like little grain in all of the dark spots and in all of the shadows. And if you're boosting ISO, that means there's a lot of dark spots and a lot of shadows in your frame. So those are going to be noticeable, especially whenever you put it onto a big screen. So you got to be very careful. You can't go too high. There's no real number that dictates that. It's all based on situation and based on the camera. But I would say on this camera, I probably wouldn't go over 10,000 on my ISO. So just kind of a general mid idea of where you should be is don't go above 10,000, because then it starts getting pretty noticeable. Again though, it's all going to come down to practice, experiment with it. You don't want a pig farm that's mistreating its pigs and I'm sneaking in at night. I can go ahead and boost my ISO as high as possible because I just need that shot, right? And my audience, they're gonna forgive me because they know the situation, right? And it's a documentary, they're gonna forgive me. But if I'm shooting a dramatic short that I'm trying to submit into a film festival and I don't have enough light, so I'm relying on my ISO and I boost it, it's gonna look bad and it's gonna take the viewer out of, you know, out of that feeling of being in a dramatic movie. So it just depends on what you're shooting, right? So always thinking about who is your audience. I will say with this camera, the native ISO, when you're shooting at 1080, which is regular high definition, which most of us will probably be shooting at that, native ISO is 1000. Okay, so you actually can't go lower than 1000. So whenever I say native ISO, I mean like that's like our baseline. If you don't need to add more light with the ISO, because you have it out here or in here, then don't change the ISO. Keep it at that base of 1000. If you're shooting in 4K, the base is 3200. You can't go below 3200. So that's already high, right? But this is an amazing camera. It's got a 35 super millimeter sensor. So the neutral density filters are a great tool to maintain depth of field and remove excess light. So you can shoot in very bright situations with a very wide open hole. You wouldn't ever want to shoot in a wide open hole if you have a ton of light, because then your thing is going to look white, right? But if you throw a neutral density filter on there, it's like sunglasses. It takes away that excess light, but it maintains your shallow depth of field, which is awesome. And we'll definitely be going over that a little bit later. So the last thing that I want to talk about in this hierarchy of light is the shutter speed. This camera is not capable of taking photos, still photos. Well, it kind of is, because what is a video? A video is just a series of photos, right? But the reason why I have shutter speed, which is our fourth thing, down here is because we're doing video. And shutter speed, when you're doing video, is not something you're going to be changing. It is married to your, so there's a direct correlation between what your frame rate is and what your shutter speed should be set to. So most of us in here are going to be shooting in 24 or in 30 frames per second. That's 24 pictures or 30 pictures per second. 24 if you're going for a more cinematic look. The trick, or the golden rule here, is to multiply your frame rate by 2. And that's going to equal what your shutter speed needs to be set to. Shutter speed is literally the amount of time that your shutter is open for. So your shutter is located inside of your camera. So light travels through the glass in the front, then it goes through what?
The aperture.
The aperture that you've decided is either small or big. Light goes through that aperture, exits the back of the barrel of the lens. It hits a wall, which is your shutter. It hits a wall and it comes into your sensor whenever what? That wall lifts, right? That shutter lifts. What's the sound a camera makes whenever it takes a picture? That's the shutter opening and closing. Light comes in, shuts, image is processed. Light comes in, shuts, image is processed. When we're doing video, that's happening 24 or 30 or 60 or 120 times per second. It's rolling shutter, it's all digital. Shutter speed is how long that shutter is open for. The longer it's open for, the what more comes in. The more of what comes in, light, right? The longer it's open, the brighter your image is going to be. That's specifically for photography. For videography, we don't want to be changing the shutter speed. It's married to the frame rate. The reason why it's married to the frame rate is because we want all 24 of those pictures to see the light equally. I don't want the first 12 of these pictures to be exposed to the light longer than the second 12. I want them all to be exposed to the light the same amount of time. So that's why we're going to multiply it by 2, because we're taking into consideration the time it opens and then the time it closes. Okay? Shutter speed is measured in seconds, so 1 full second, 1/10 of a second, 1/100th of a second, or 1/1000th of a second. When we're doing video, we're always going to be in 1 tenths of a second. 24 times 2, 48. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be set to 1/48th of a second. Not all cameras will have 1/48th of a second. A lot of them will have 1/50th of a second. Go with that one because you want it to be either twice or as close to as possible as twice. So what would 30 be?
60.
1/60th of a second. This right here is probably what you're going to be shooting 95% of the time. 30 frames per second, 1/60th is your shutter speed. Again, don't change your shutter speed whenever you're doing video. That's just the golden rule times 2. You start messing with it, you're going to start running into all sorts of issues. Sometimes you will be tempted to mess with it, just don't. Okay. So just to kind of finish off with the frame rate thing, let's say if we were to do a 1-second video of me throwing this marker at that wall. It took exactly 1 second from here to there. If we were shooting, if we wanted to make that in slow motion, you would want to shoot as many frames as possible, because if we're doing 30 frames, well, you got a picture here, picture here, picture here, right, picture here, and whenever you put that together, it looks choppy. But if we were to shoot at 120 frames, well, now all of a sudden I got a picture here, picture here, picture here, picture here, picture here, right? It's going to look a lot more smooth, and you can see every single individual frame, right, as it's hitting that wall. But what is happening to our light? Because of the shutter speed times 2 rule. What is our shutter speed here at 120? If I'm shooting 120 frames, 240. 240. So now what happened to the light? This is a much faster.
You have less light.
You have a lot less light. So what do we got to do?
Turn on the ISO.
I mean, you could. You could add more lights, open up those windows. If that doesn't work, if that's not an option, well, maybe we want to open up our aperture more. Well, what if we already had it all the way wide open? Well, then we come down to our ISO, right? So you guys see how this all kind of works with each other. Little give, little take. You guys see that? Feel pretty good about that? Cool. This right here is the most important stuff that we're going to talk about today. This right here is the foundation for every single camera, every single Sony, Canon, Nikon, Panasonic, doesn't matter. This is the ground rule for how light creates an image. The best part about it is if you're in manual mode, which we're going to be in manual mode the entire day today, is you get to set all of these parameters yourself. You get to decide how much light is coming in. So whenever you're out there on a shoot, there's so many things going on, right? You have so many different people and you're directing or there's so many things going on. So it's really helpful to think about it in steps. Really helpful to think about it compartmentalizing it like this. So the last thing I want to talk about while I'm up here is resolution. Because it does come into play with this camera since it is capable of 4K. Before I move on to resolution, do we have any questions about any of this stuff up here? The bigger the hole, what about the depth of field? As you expand that hole, you're shrinking, you're making your depth of field more shallow, right? Which is ideal for portraits, for interviews of people, for smaller subjects, right? Or just to make things look, for lack of a better term, prettier. ISO, the higher you go, the brighter, shutter speed, we know it's married to the frame rate. Cool. Moving on to resolution. I'm going to draw 2 boxes right here. And these boxes are going to represent our frame. Same size, we're going to pretend these are the same size. This one over here, this one down here, is going to be 2160. This is HD. This is 4K, or also known as ultra high definition. Same space, okay? But up here in 1080, that refers to, because our ratio is 16:9, right? Back in the day, whenever we had the square like that TV, the ratio is 16:9. Our phone was 16:9. Back in the day, everything was 4:3, right? A little bit more square. Now everything's 16:9. So the ratio over here, we got 1080, so that's pixels, 1080 pixels going this way, 1920 pixels going this way. Now what is a pixel? It's literally a tiny little square that has information with it. Color, luminosity, which is brightness, contrast, saturation, all of that stuff. It has information in one pixel. Ultimately, you have to multiply these together, right? 1920 by 1080, and that's going to comprise all of your, I'm not going to draw them all, but those are all pixels. 1920 this way, 1080 this way, that's millions of pixels that create the entire image, right? Over here, we have the same amount of space, same space, but we have twice the amount of pixels. So we have 2160 from here to here. And 3840 from here to here. So you multiply these two together and you have that many more million pixels. So your image is going to look sharper. The colors are going to be more true. They're going to be better. Everything's just going to look better. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a bigger picture. It just means that there's going to be more resolution in it.
That explains the size of the file.
That explains it, exactly. So now you have all this more information. That means your file size is going to be much bigger. So it's much more harder to work with. You need more space. You need to have the right hardware whenever you're editing, so on and so forth. The real benefit, though, for now, until everybody gets 4K televisions and 4K phones, is that you have more stylistic options as an editor.
You can crop.
You can crop, exactly. So if there's a boom mic in the way, or if maybe have a 3-shot, but you're the one that's talking and they're kind of making faces, and like, man, they ruined the shot. That's okay. I can just come in and crop on you. You know what I mean?
With 1080?
You can, but it just doesn't look like lower.
Yeah, lower resolution, right? So if you go, you can crop in 50%. I can zoom in 50% if I'm here, and I'm going to be left with this, which is still high definition. So you can crop 50% of this. I can zoom in 50%, same exact space, right? We're just zooming in, and you're still in high definition.
It's a numbers game.
It's a numbers game, exactly. There's more pixels. But again, if you're shooting 4K, you gotta make sure that you're creating what's called proxies. A proxy is just like a fake version. So you're shooting in 4K, which is these huge file sizes, but your proxy, and you can do it in camera, but I wouldn't recommend it because it's a nightmare, because the audio for the proxies isn't synced to the audio of your 4K, and it's very, very difficult to get that back. So somebody needs to work on that, but it's okay because Adobe Premiere, does anybody here edit in Adobe Premiere? Adobe Premiere has built-in proxies. So you can import all of your 4K footage and then create a proxy for all of your 4K footage at 720. So now you're working with high definition film. This is what you're editing. You're editing all of this, but it's just kind of disguised, or this is just disguised as 720. So this exists on your computer, and any changes that you make to these files is also going to be made to these, but your computer is just reading these. You have to create a proxy in the Adobe Premiere. So any changes that you make to the proxy files, which are the downgraded files, are being made to the 4K in the background.
When you render, is the audio slow as well?
The
quality is.
Yep.
Oh, wow.
So when you render, you're not rendering this. You're rendering this. So it's still going to take a long time to render. It's not rendering 720. It's rendering 4K. But you're editing 720, so you can actually edit. Because if you're trying to edit 4K and you don't have the latest, baddest, greatest computer, you're going to have a nightmare. Everything's super slow, especially once you start adding effects. You guys feel good about this? I feel good about this class. From here on out, it's just learning the buttons and the knobs and how to actually change this stuff. And then we'll go over the super slow motion, we'll go over the neutral density, we'll go over the audio, and we'll go over the menu, okay? Outside of that, we can go over the tripod if you want, but that's pretty much it. There will be a little quiz, and most of it is comprised of this stuff up here, and I'll keep this stuff up here. And then another thing I want to mention is like there's no possible way you're going to remember all this stuff. Like this took years and years for me to remember, and lots of money. I went to film school at UT. So keep on supplementing your education. Go home, watch some videos, go home, study this. But the best way to learn is to actually check these guys out and to go practice. If you don't have a project, if you don't have anything to shoot, it doesn't matter. Go outside, shoot your favorite trees. Go to a youth soccer, well maybe not, don't do that. You know, go shoot trains coming by. Go on I-35 and shoot the cars. Go downtown and just shoot buildings. A really popular adapter is called the Metabones, and you will have access to that when you take the cinematography class. So to put on the lens, you're going to notice there's a dot at the top of your lens. By the way, whenever it's exposed like this, obviously
Don't touch.
it's more vulnerable, right? Don't touch any of the things, don't let dust or water get into it. Line up your white dot with the white dot on your lens mount. So you line up those two dots, and then you just twist to the right. Line up those two dots and twist to the right. And then to take it off, obviously, you press this button and then go the opposite way. Right? And now it's off. You can put on a new lens if you wanted a different lens. Easy enough. Guess what? It took me 2 years before I found out there were dots. I was like, how is everybody so good at doing that?
No video,
Dang, there's people that just know.
You're a 40-year-old virgin.
Yeah. So that's how you put on the lens. Now for the battery, everybody looks like they have their battery in. Good, so we found out how to do that. There is a battery release button in the back too, which is at the top next to the eye finder. So you press that button and then you just pop it right back up. Okay, that's how you the cool thing about these batteries, these are the BPU 90s. So these big fat ones,
Those are hunkers, aren't they?
they're hunkers. This battery will last you about 4 hours on a fully charged. And you can press that button and it'll show you how much battery you have on.
It's been working.
The BPU 60s and then the BPU 30s are obviously much smaller and you'll get like 2 hours on this.
Nope.
Always have a backup battery with you and the charger as well.
When you check out the camera, how many batteries does it?
You get 2.
Sweet.
So just a couple of other things about this camera. You can adjust your grip. This is the handle, this is the grip. So I'm going to be talking about those two things. Handle, grip. You can adjust your grip. If you slip your hand in and you use your thumb on the release button, you can adjust it all sorts of ways. So I could come up here. It was just my HDMI cable. And I could shoot something like this, right? If I'm at a concert and I was like, hey crowd, do something crazy. I can view it and I can shoot. And there are ways that you hold the camera to make it more steady. The more out your elbows are, the easier it is to mess up. So keep your elbows in, nice and tight. If you have a strap, keep that strap nice and taut. So then you're putting pressure on it as you're extending out like this. Another really good way to keep it stable is by using your eyes. Just by coming in here. So I don't have a pad, it's much easier with a pad. But you can only use the eye if you deactivate your LCD monitor. So you can only use one or the other, you can't use them both. And the way to deactivate your monitor is on the top, you just press, you just switch it to off. When you switch it to off, you are activating your eyepiece. Okay? So the eyepiece is a really good way to stabilize, and it's also a good way to whenever you're this close, you're a lot more engaged with it, because here you're seeing all these other things, right? I also use this whenever I'm starting off an event, just to get people comfortable, and myself, Because sometimes whenever you're at an event, it's like really uncomfortable shooting people. So I kind of like, if I'm like this,
Come up to us awkwardly like that.
you know, if I'm like this, I'm a little bit more hidden, you know? And then it gets everybody familiar, like, oh, there's a camera guy here. And then afterwards, like, hey, yo, let me get you, you know, smile or whatever. So, if you do end up getting a little too shaky, and you notice you're a little too shaky, which is fine, there's effects in Premiere, warp effect, that'll stabilize, warp stabilizer is what it's called.
Don't distort the.
It could, if you're too crazy, yeah, it's going to be distorted. But if you're just a little bit, it does a really good job.
Okay.
And After Effects has an even better warp stabilizer. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn on my camera. It's time to turn on our cameras. And the way you do that is by flipping your switch that says Sony on it, or Sony right above it, go towards your lens. So yeah, they just talked about whether you want to put it in slot A or slot B. That's another cool thing about this camera is it has 2 slots, so you can do simultaneous recording where you're backing it up onto another card, or you can do relay recording where one card runs out, it's going to automatically jump to the other card. Doesn't matter if you just have one card, doesn't matter if you put it in A or B, your camera's going to read it. The metal parts of your card are facing away. You might want to write this down. SDXC. That's the type of card you need for this camera. If you're shooting on SDHC, which is one of the most popular types of cards, but now it's getting outdated, it's not going to work. So you need SDXC. So SDXC, I'd recommend getting something 64 gigabytes or higher as far as card storage space, especially if you're using 4K. And then your read-write speed, which is the megabytes per second, should be 90 or higher, so that it can actually keep up with this camera.
Megabytes a second?
So read-write speed, which is how fast does that card read the data that's coming to it, and how fast does it spit it back out, 90 megabytes per second or faster. Because right now, we're shooting at 50 megabytes per second. You can see that little 50 right there. So that's more than enough space, or more than enough compatibility to be able to produce the speed that this data needs to get onto the card. Because what's happening is as you're recording, all that information goes into your sensor, right? But your sensor has to package it, like a little UPS truck, packages it, puts it in a vehicle called a codec, that's like your vehicle, and it shoots it out to the card. So the data needs to transfer from sensor to card, right? So that all has to do with the speed and how efficient it is. Okay, so now that we've turned it on, I want us to go ahead and take a look at the lens. The barrel that is furthest, I mean not the barrel, the ring that is furthest away from the body is your focus ring. And before we do anything, let's make sure we're not in full auto. So there's a button on the side next to Sony that says full auto.
Alright.
Yeah. Make sure that is not
Can you
activated.
reach the ring easily?
Okay.
Oh, it does make a difference, honestly, at least to me. But
Another thing that I want us to make sure is that our focus is in manual. So go down to manual on your focus, which is right underneath number 2. So you have 1, 2, and then you see focus, it's a switch. Make sure that is in manual. Did everybody get that? Manual focus.
Oh, okay.
Make sure it's in manual. Okay, that ensures that we're shooting in manual everything.
Where was that?
Right underneath button number 2, the picture profile catcher. Focus ring. You can tell because, right, we're doing focus, right? This camera mixed with this G series lens does really good autofocus. So if you have this particular setup, don't be afraid to use autofocus. It's really good. But again, the camera doesn't know everything that you want, so it's going to do its best job to guess, but it does a really good job of guessing. But for the purposes of this, we're going to be in manual. The next barrel ring is your zoom ring, okay? There are 1, 2, 3, 4 places to zoom. on this camera. One is this ring. The next one is this T and W switch still on the lens. It's just a switch, T for tight, W for wide. The third place is up here on your handle. And this one's cool because it's fixed. So you can decide how fast or how slow you want it to go. Not by the pressure that you're applying, but by just pressing it. You can make it go super slow, even if you're pressing it really hard. Whereas this one over here, which is the most convenient, is a variable zoom. So however hard you press it is however hard it's going to zoom.